Inside a small tent made of felt, somewhere on the grasslands north of the Black Sea, a man crouches over a shallow dish of hot stones. He drops a handful of hemp seeds onto them. The seeds hiss, then catch, and the closed space fills with a thick, resinous smoke that has nowhere to go. He breathes it in. Then he starts to howl, not in pain, in pleasure. A Greek traveler named Herodotus wrote this scene down around 2,500 years ago, describing the Scythians, a nomadic people he found strange and a little frightening. For centuries afterwards, scholars assumed he had exaggerated, the way travelers do, turning some foreign bathing ritual into a lurid story about smoke and shrieking. Then archaeologists opened a set of frozen tombs in the Altai Mountains of Siberia and found the actual equipment. Small six-pole tent frames, bronze vessels holding charred stones, and hemp seeds sitting right where he said they would be. The man in that tent was not doing anything new. He was near the tail end of a habit already so old that nobody could have told you where it began. Which raises a question that turns out to be much harder to answer than it sounds, and much older than almost anyone expects. If this is already landing, subscribe and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. So here is the question. When did humans start using drugs to get high? Not medicine, not food, not the accidental buzz of overripe fruit, but the deliberate use of a plant or a substance to change how the mind works. The instinct is to treat this as a modern problem, or at least a civilized one. Something that arrived with cities, with idle time, with the kind of surplus that gives people the freedom to ruin themselves. The picture in most people's heads is a straight line running downhill. Simple, sober ancestors at the top. Us at the bottom, chemically overloaded, and always looking for the next escape. That picture feels intuitive. It is also backwards. The deeper researchers look, the further back the behavior runs, and the more universal it turns out to be. It isn't confined to one clever civilization that stumbled onto fermentation and passed it around. It appears independently on every inhabited continent, among people who never met, never traded, never shared a single idea. And it appears early. It runs right through the middle of the human story, sitting alongside the first art, the first burials, the first music. Start with the part that predates humanity altogether. Buried in your DNA is a gene called ADH4, which builds an enzyme your body uses to break down alcohol. Around 10 million years ago, in the common ancestor we share with chimpanzees and gorillas, that gene picked up a single mutation that made the enzyme roughly 40 times more efficient at metabolizing ethanol. 10 million years. Long before anyone brewed anything on purpose. The reason is on the forest floor. Our ancestors were spending more time on the ground, and the ground is where fallen fruit collects and ferments. To an animal eating that fruit, the smell of alcohol was not a warning. It was a dinner bell. A biologist named Robert Dudley built an entire hypothesis around this, sometimes called the drunken monkey. His argument is that the appetite for alcohol is millions of years old, and that we inherited it rather than invented it. For a very long stretch of our evolution, the faint smell of ethanol reliably pointed our ancestors toward the ripest, most calorie-dense fruit, the stuff that was just beginning to break down and was easiest to digest. The animals drawn to that smell ate better. The ones drawn to it and able to process it without falling out of a tree ate better still. So the pull you might feel toward a drink is running on machinery millions of years older than the drink. Your body was tuned to seek out that exact compound long before any human thought to concentrate it. That is where this story really begins. Not with a person and a plant, but with a primate and a windfall of rotting fruit. Which leads to something a lot of people find uncomfortable. We are not the only animal that does this. On the Caribbean island of St. Kitts, there is a population of vervet monkeys descended from animals brought over centuries ago during the rum trade. Somewhere along the way, they acquired a taste for alcohol, and today they raid beach bars, snatching half-finished cocktails off the tables when the tourists look away. Researchers who studied their drinking found the spread of behavior eerily familiar. Most of the monkeys drank socially and in moderation. A smaller group drank heavily. A few avoided it completely. The proportions were not far off from what you would find in a room full of people. In Tasmania, wallabies wander into the fields where opium poppies are grown legally for the pharmaceutical industry. They eat the poppy heads, get thoroughly intoxicated, and hop in slow, disoriented circles, flattening loops into the crop that officials once genuinely struggled to explain. Reindeer in Siberia have been seen digging through snow to reach one specific red and white mushroom, the fly agaric, then staggering off afterward with their heads swaying low to the ground. None of this proves the animals are chasing a high the way a person consciously does, and researchers still argue about how deliberate any of it really is. But the pattern is hard to wave away. The urge to alter your own state does not look like a uniquely human failing. It looks like something much older, sitting in the nervous system of a lot of different animals, waiting for the right plant to come along. Now to the actual human evidence, and the first thing that jumps out is how far back it runs, and how clever it already was. Some of the oldest direct proof is sitting in people's teeth. In Duyong Cave, on the island of Palawan in the Philippines, archaeologists found a burial more than 4,000 years old, with the teeth stained a deep reddish brown. That stain is the signature of beetle chewing, the areca nut wrapped in a leaf with a pinch of lime, a mild stimulant still chewed by millions of people across Asia and the Pacific today. The same reddened teeth show up at other ancient sites across Southeast Asia, which tells you the habit was already widespread thousands of years ago, not some local quirk. On the other side of the world, in a dry valley in northern Peru, there is evidence that people were chewing coca leaves around 8,000 years ago. And here is the detail that should stop you. They were not just chewing the leaf, they were chewing it together with lime made from burned shells and stone, because that alkaline lime is exactly what pulls the active compound out of the leaf and makes it work. That is a real chemical trick. Coca on its own does very little. Coca with an alkaline additive is a completely different experience. Nobody in that valley could have written the reaction down. They had no word for an alkaloid, and no concept of an enzyme. What they had was time and attention and enough repeated trial and error to land on a method a chemist today would look at and call basically correct. If this video is giving you something to think about, subscribe and turn on notifications. It helps us keep making content like this. Keep going west and back in time, and the plants get stronger. In a cave on the coast of southern Spain, near a town called Albuñol, a group of 19th century miners looking for bat guano stumbled into a chamber full of burials. Woven grass bags had been laid beside the dead. Inside those bags, when researchers finally examined them properly, were the seed capsules of the opium poppy. The site is roughly 6,000 years old. Someone had gathered opium poppies, placed them carefully with their dead, and treated them as something worth carrying into the grave. That is not a plant you eat by accident. The opium poppy has to be recognized, harvested, and processed, and the fact that it was buried with people suggests it meant something beyond a passing high. It sat at the intersection of medicine, ritual, and death, which is exactly where a lot of these substances end up. Then there is a find from a rock shelter in southwestern Texas, in the lower Pecos, that pushes the timeline back further than almost anyone guessed. Researchers there recovered peyote buttons, the dried crown of a small spineless cactus, that were carbon dated to around 5,700 years ago. When the buttons were chemically analyzed all that time later, they still contained mescaline, the compound responsible for peyote's powerful effects. Nearly 6,000 years, and the active ingredient was still detectable in the tissue. Sit with the length of that. People in that landscape were using a hallucinogenic cactus before the pyramids were built, before writing existed anywhere on Earth. This was not a late refinement layered on top of civilization. It was already deep in the human repertoire, while the first cities were still an idea nobody had had yet. The pattern holds even for the plant most people assume is recent. In a cave in the mountains of Utah, archaeologists digging through an ancient hearth found 4 tiny charred tobacco seeds, sitting in a fireplace, used by hunter-gatherers around 12,300 years ago. 12,000 years. Thousands of years before anyone farmed tobacco, before it was bred into the crop that would eventually circle the globe, people at the edge of the last ice age were already gathering the wild plant and doing something with it around a fire. None of these were farmers with time on their hands. They were mobile foragers, moving with the seasons, carrying only what mattered. And what mattered, apparently, included the plant that alters your head, which forces a harder question. Why? Why would people with genuinely thin survival margins spend effort seeking out substances that make them slower, dizzier, less alert, in a world where slow and dizzy could get you killed? The easy answer is that it feels good, and that is true, but it is not the whole answer. The more interesting one has to do with what these substances were actually for, because getting high, in most of the ancient world, was rarely a private act of pleasure. It was a doorway. Across an enormous range of cultures, the altered state was the point of contact with another world. The shaman who ate the mushroom or drank the brew was not escaping reality. He was traveling, going somewhere the rest of the group could not go, to speak with the dead, to find the cause of a sickness, to locate the herd, to bring something back. The strangeness of the experience was not a side effect. It was the evidence that the journey was real. And that reframes the whole behavior. A substance that reliably produces visions is, to a group that believes in a spirit world, one of the most valuable tools imaginable. It does something no ordinary object can do. It changes what a person is able to perceive. In that context, seeking it out is not weakness or idleness. It is closer to technology, a repeatable method for reaching a place that mattered enormously to how these people understood their lives and their deaths. There is one object that captures this better than anything else, and it is worth describing in full. In a rock shelter in the highlands of southwestern Bolivia, in a dry cave nearly 4,000 meters up, archaeologists found a bundle that had been left behind roughly 1,000 years ago. Inside was a ritual kit, carved wooden tubes for inhaling, a pair of small spatulas, and a pouch, stitched together from the snouts of 3 foxes, their muzzles sewn side by side into a single container. When researchers analyzed the residue inside that pouch, they found something that stopped them. Not one substance, 5. Cocaine, from coca leaves. Benzoylecgonine, a compound the body produces as it breaks cocaine down. Harmine and dimethyltryptamine, the 2 ingredients that together form the visionary brew known today as ayahuasca. And bufotenine, another powerful psychoactive compound. Traces of at least 3 different plants, and possibly the secretions of a toad, all carried in one small kit by one person. Think about what that requires. Those plants do not grow together. Coca comes from the eastern slopes of the Andes. The ingredients for that brew grow lower still, in the Amazon basin. To assemble that pouch, someone had to know which plants did what, had to combine them in a way that worked, and had to source them across wildly different landscapes and altitudes, moving them up to a cave 4,000 meters in the sky. That is not stumbling onto fermented fruit. That is a body of specialized knowledge, held by a specialist, carried in a purpose-built container that someone sewed from 3 fox faces because this kit was worth that kind of care. 1,000 years ago, in the thin, cold air of the Andes, somebody was a professional at this. And the tools in that bag were treated with exactly the seriousness you would expect of something central to the life of the community, not something hidden at its edges. So step back and look at the whole span at once. The gene for processing alcohol, 10 million years old, older than the human line itself. Tobacco seeds in an Ice Age hearth 12,000 years ago. Peyote holding its mescaline for nearly 6,000 years in a Texas rock shelter. Opium buried with the dead in Spain. Coca chewed with lime, the chemistry already solved, 8,000 years ago in Peru. And a single Bolivian pouch, 1,000 years old, holding 5 substances at once. Here is the turn. We tend to think of drug use as a sign that something has gone wrong. A modern sickness, a failure of discipline, a symptom of a world too comfortable and too idle for its own good. A departure from how humans are supposed to be. The evidence points somewhere else entirely. This is not a departure from human nature. It is human nature, running back as far as we can see and probably further, showing up independently in people who shared nothing else, sitting right beside the things we are proudest of. The same species that painted the caves and buried its dead with care and carried its knowledge across mountain ranges also, everywhere it went, found the plants that changed the mind and built entire practices around them. The urge did not arrive with us, and it did not corrupt us. It was already there in the primate reaching for the fermented fruit, already there in the forager tending 4 tiny seeds in a fire at the edge of the ice. It is not the exception to the human story. It is one of its oldest and most constant threads, woven straight through everything else. Which means the question we started with was slightly wrong. It was never really about when humans started. There may not have been a start, not a clean one, not a moment before which nobody had ever sought this and after which someone did. Go back to that man in the felt tent on the grassland, breathing in the smoke and beginning to howl. Herodotus thought he was watching something foreign, a strange custom belonging to a strange people at the edge of the known world. He was actually watching something almost unimaginably familiar, a person doing what people had already been doing for tens of thousands of years. On every continent, in the dark of caves and the light of fires, reaching past the ordinary world toward whatever they believed was waiting on the other side. It was never their habit, or the ancient world's habit. It is ours, and it always has been. You inherited this one too. Thank you for watching. More videos are on your screen now, and if you haven't already, Subscribe. We'll see you in the next one.